Claude responded. 17 years after I pulled a 6-year-old boy out of a dumpster enclosure behind a diner in Tulsa, his billionaire father stood in a hotel ballroom in hell. 17 years after I pulled a 6-year-old boy out of a dumpster enclosure behind a diner in Tulsa, his billionaire father stood in a hotel ballroom and held out a set of keys to a downtown penthouse. "You've earned the right to finally live like a Callahan," he said. My son looked at the keys. Then he looked at me. I wish I could tell you I knew what he was going to do next. I didn't. I was standing near the coat check with a folded $20 bill in my shirt pocket, the only cash I had left after paying for gas to get to Oklahoma City that morning. My tie was 30 years old, a clip-on I'd worn to my wife's funeral, and then never again until that night. None of that bothered me until the elevator doors opened, and a man in a charcoal suit walked in like he already owned the room. That's where this story ends up. But it starts 18 years earlier, on a July night so hot the asphalt hadn't cooled by midnight. I was 44 then, working the graveyard shift as a security guard at a self-storage facility off Route 66. I'd taken the job 2 years after my wife Carol died of a brain aneurysm, back when I couldn't stand being in the house at night with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator for company. That particular night, I was doing my last walkthrough before my replacement showed up when I heard something behind the dumpster enclosure at the Denny's next door. I almost ignored it. Raccoons got into that dumpster all the time. But then I heard a cough, small and wet, not an animal's cough. I shone my flashlight around the corner and found a boy folded up against the brick wall, knees pulled to his chest, wearing a t-shirt 3 sizes too big and no shoes. "Hey there," I said, keeping my voice low. He flinched like I'd shouted. "I'm not going to hurt you." He didn't answer. His lips were cracked and his eyes had that glassy, far-off look kids get when they've stopped expecting anyone to help. I crouched down, knees popping the way they'd started to that year. "You got a name?" Nothing. "You hungry?" A pause. Then the smallest nod I'd ever seen a human being make. I walked him inside the Denny's, and the night manager, a woman named Rosa who'd worked there since it opened, took one look at him and didn't ask me a single question. Just started plating pancakes. He ate like someone had told him it might be his last meal. Halfway through, he wrapped 2 strips of bacon in a napkin and slid them into his waistband. "You can have more," I told him. "For later," he said. First words out of his mouth all night. I asked him his name again. "Marcus," he finally said. "Marcus what?" He shrugged like the second half didn't matter, or like he'd been told not to give it. I asked where his people were. He got quiet in a way that told me everything the words wouldn't. I called it in. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet call to the police from the payphone by the restrooms. He heard the word police through the wall and bolted before I even hung up the receiver. By the time I caught up to him, he'd made it 3 blocks, barefoot, on pavement that was still radiating the day's heat, and he went down hard on a curb, tearing open his knee. "Get away from me," he said, scrambling backward like a spooked animal. "I already called them," I said. "I'm not taking you anywhere. I just don't want you out here alone." He sat on that curb and cried without making a sound, like he'd learned a long time ago that crying loud got you noticed, and getting noticed wasn't safe. The police showed up, and a caseworker named Diane arrived about 40 minutes later, a heavy-set woman with tired eyes who'd clearly done this 1,000 times. She got him talking a little, enough to learn he'd run from a group home 2 counties over. "Why'd he run?" I asked her. She looked at me carefully before answering, like she was deciding whether I could handle it. "Older kid in the placement," she said. Staff didn't catch it in time. I felt something in my chest go hard and cold. "Where's his family?" "Mother's whereabouts unknown. Father's never been part of the picture," according to the file. I looked at Marcus sitting in the back of the patrol car, holding that napkin of bacon like it was the only thing he owned in the world, which, as it turned out, it basically was. I didn't bring him home that night. That's not how it actually works, no matter what the movies tell you. But I called Diane the next morning, and I kept calling, and 3 weeks later I asked what it would take for a widower with no kids of his own to become a licensed foster parent. Background checks, home inspections, financial reviews. A parade of questions that felt like they were designed to make you give up before you finish the paperwork. I didn't give up. It took 9 months before Marcus walked through the door of my little house on Independence Avenue carrying his belongings in a black garbage bag, the same kind they'd handed him at every placement before mine, like the world had already decided what kind of child he was. He didn't trust anything for a long time. He hid crackers in his pillowcase. He slept in his clothes, shoes lined up by the bed, ready to run. Every morning he packed his bag before school, certain someone would move him again before he got home. One evening, about 2 months in, he knocked a coffee mug off the counter, and it shattered on the tile, and he froze like he'd committed a crime, both hands pressed flat against his sides, waiting for whatever came next. I picked up the broom. "It's just a mug," I said. "We got more." He stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "That's it? What else would there be?" His chin started trembling, and then he sat down right there on the kitchen floor and cried the way kids cry when they've been holding it in for years. Almost 2 years after that, a judge finalized the adoption, and outside the courthouse, Marcus asked me, very quietly, "Does this mean nobody can take me anywhere else?" "Not unless you're planning on shipping me off to a nursing home someday." He laughed, actually laughed, and called me Dad for the first time right there on the courthouse steps. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't find out for 17 years, was that his biological father, a man named Richard Callahan, had known exactly where Marcus was the whole time. He knew what street I lived on. He knew which elementary school Marcus walked to. He knew about the years I worked doubles at the storage facility just to keep the lights on. And for 17 years, that man watched from a distance and never once knocked on the door. The years in between are the part I remember best, better than almost anything else in my life. When Marcus was 9, I found a rusted-out BMX bike at a yard sale for $8, and we spent 2 Saturdays sanding it down and repainting it red in the garage. The first time he rode it without me holding the seat, he made it to the end of the driveway before tipping into Mrs. Ferris's rose bushes. "Don't help me," he snapped when I ran over. I wasn't going to. He climbed back on with thorns still scratching his arm and tried again. That was Marcus. He'd accept a Band-Aid eventually, but only after he'd proven to himself he didn't need one. At 13, he got suspended for shoving a kid in gym class who'd called him trash can boy after somehow finding out where I'd found him. The assistant principal called me at the storage facility. When I got to the school, Marcus was sitting in the office with his arms crossed and a scrape on his elbow. I wanted so badly to tell him I understood exactly why he'd done it. Instead, I said, "You're apologizing to him. He started it. He used words. You used your hands. That's not how we do things. So I'm just supposed to let people say whatever they want about me? No. You walk away, or you report it, or you use words back. You don't get to hit somebody just because they found the thing that hurts." He wouldn't talk to me the whole drive home, but I stopped at the Waffle House anyway. "I thought I was grounded," he muttered. "Grounded people still gotta eat." Over hash browns, I told him he didn't have to be ashamed of where he'd come from, but he didn't get to use that shame as a license to be cruel to other people either. He pushed his fork around his plate and said, "I hate it when you make sense." He apologized to that kid the next day. Didn't mean every word of it, but he said it. By high school, Marcus had become the kind of student teachers remembered, not for raising his hand the most, but for staying after class asking questions nobody else thought to ask. He was sharp with numbers in a way I never was. When he took physics his junior year, I spent 3 nights a week relearning material at our kitchen table so I could quiz him, filling half a notepad with formulas I barely understood, getting things wrong that he'd correct with a patience that made me proud and a little embarrassed at the same time. Those Tuesday nights, burnt grilled cheese, arguing about his curfew, are what I think of when I think of what it means to raise somebody. Not the big moments, the small ones nobody's keeping score on. When he got into Oklahoma State's engineering program on a partial scholarship, he ran into the kitchen waving the acceptance letter over his head. The scholarship covered tuition, but not the dorm deposit, not the books, not the lab fees nobody warns you about in the brochure. I told him we'd figure it out, and he told me not to do anything stupid. So naturally, I sold my late wife's old sedan, the one I kept in the garage under a cover, and only drove twice a year because getting rid of it felt like giving up the last piece of her I had left. A man from Broken Arrow gave me $3,800 for it. Marcus came home that weekend, saw the empty space in the garage, and his face went through about 4 different expressions before landing on angry. "Where's Mom's car?" "Sold it." "Why?" "You needed the deposit. That was hers." "I know whose it was, Marcus." He put his bag down hard enough that I heard something inside it rattle. "I told you not to give up things for me." "I'm not giving anything up. I'm choosing where to put it." He looked away and wiped his face with the back of his hand, And later that night, he told me that someday he was going to buy me a car twice as nice, and I told him I'd settle for him paying his own cell phone bill on time. College changed him the way it's supposed to change a person, and it changed me too, mostly by making me feel older than I actually was. My knees started complaining on stairs. My hands went numb sometimes after long drives. I started forgetting where I'd set my glasses down. Small things. Nothing I wanted to worry him with while he was buried in coursework. I retired from the storage facility a little earlier than planned, after a fall in the parking lot during an ice storm that didn't break anything but reminded me my body had kept a tally I couldn't argue with anymore. On the morning of his graduation, I drove up from Tulsa at 5:30 in my old truck, wearing that same clip-on tie with a folded $20 bill and a handwritten card in my jacket pocket. It wasn't much. It was what I had. The ceremony went the way ceremonies go. Marcus's name called, me on my feet clapping before anyone around me had even stood up, a woman beside me smiling and saying, "That's somebody's proud father," and me saying, "That's my son," loud enough that a few heads turned. Afterward, there was a reception in the ballroom of a hotel near campus. Some kind of scholarship gala the engineering department was hosting alongside graduation. And that's when a man I'd never met walked in, flanked by two people in suits who looked like they got paid to make other people nervous. He introduced himself to the room as Richard Callahan, and even people who didn't follow the business channels seemed to recognize the name. Callahan Energy had its logo on half the oil derricks and pipeline trucks in that part of the state. He gave a short speech about innovation and the next generation, the kind of speech rich men give when they want applause for showing up. Then his tone shifted, and he turned toward Marcus. "There's another reason this young man matters to me," he said, and the room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone senses something is about to happen that they weren't invited to. "I am his biological father." Nobody cheered. Marcus didn't look shocked, which frightened me more than the announcement itself did, because it meant he already knew. An assistant stepped forward holding a small case, and inside it were the keys to a penthouse condo downtown, the kind with a name instead of an address. "You've spent your whole life proving what kind of man you are," Richard said, holding the keys out. "You've earned the right to finally live like a Callahan." Marcus took them. My hand closed around the folded 20 in my pocket like it might disappear if I didn't hold on tight enough. Then Richard produced a folder, cream-colored, the kind meant to look important even before you open it. "Just one small formality," he said, "before we move forward as a family." A man beside him held out a pen. Marcus took the folder, but not the pen. "What exactly is this?" he asked. "A reconciliation agreement," Richard said smoothly, "so we can move forward without outside interference." "What kind of interference?" "Reporters, lawyers, people who'll try to exploit the situation." He said, "People," the way men like him say it when they mean anyone inconvenient. He turned to the room and started listing things. An apartment, a position at Callahan Energy, access to the family ranch outside Bartlesville, a transition allowance for whatever Marcus might need while adjusting to his new life. Those two words landed on me harder than anything else he'd said. I looked around at the caterers standing near the untouched hors d'oeuvres, at the other graduates holding plastic champagne flutes, all of them watching. I looked down at my cracked dress shoes, at the $20 bill in my pocket, and for one ugly second I thought, maybe this is what he deserves, not my drafty little house, not a father whose knees give out on stairs. Then another part of me wanted Marcus to throw those keys straight through the ballroom window, wanted him to call this man a coward to his face, wanted him to say none of it mattered. That was my hurt talking, and I knew it. Marcus opened the folder slowly, turned one page, then another. "You've read every word of this?" he asked Richard. "My lawyers prepared it." "That's not what I asked." The smile on Richard's face thinned out just slightly. "Yes, I've reviewed it." Marcus kept reading, and I saw yellow tabs marking pages, signature lines, initial boxes, the whole apparatus of a document built to be signed quickly and regretted later. "You can take your time," the man with the pen said, which struck me as a strange thing to say while holding a pen an inch from someone's hand. Marcus pointed at a paragraph. "This says I acknowledge you made reasonable efforts to find me and support me." Standard language. "Is it true?" "We never stopped caring about you, Marcus." "That's not what I asked." A few phones lowered. This had stopped feeling like a happy surprise for anybody in that room. Richard folded his hands. "I was young. There were complications with my family. with your mother's situation, threats I won't go into here. I made the decision I believed gave you the best chance. Then help me understand it. How long have you known where I was? Marcus asked. Richard hesitated just long enough. I always hoped you were safe. How long? I received updates from time to time, before or after my 10th birthday. The question was too specific to be a guess, and I watched Richard's eyes flick toward one of his attorneys. That was the moment I realized Marcus had walked into that ballroom already knowing more than I did. He reached into the pocket of his graduation gown and pulled out a folded page. What is that? Richard asked, his voice losing some of its polish. Marcus opened it. A report from Hargrove Investigations, dated September of that year. He read from it, and I recognized the address, my old address, and a line about Marcus attending Lincoln Elementary, no immediate safety concerns noted, and then a line that stopped my heart cold. Subject's guardian has taken on additional shifts. Child's orthodontic treatment may be creating financial strain. I remembered that year. Marcus needed a partial plate for his teeth, and the insurance covered less than half. I'd picked up weekend security contracts at 2 different warehouses for almost 5 months. I told him I liked the extra hours. Somebody had been watching us the entire time and writing it down like we were a case file instead of a life. I hired people because I needed to know you were safe. Richard said, you knew I needed dental work. That isn't the same as understanding your situation. You knew my dad was working doubles. I was advised not to interfere. By who? My legal team. Marcus's voice never rose. Did they advise you against sending a birthday card too? Nobody in that ballroom moved. I wanted to step in, but this wasn't my moment to take from him. He'd earned the right to ask it himself. I know how this looks, Richard said quietly. It doesn't look like anything, Marcus said. It is what it is. A university staff member started drifting toward the podium, probably hoping to end things gracefully, and Marcus held up one hand. Almost done. He turned toward the crowd. 3 weeks ago, I was contacted by an attorney named Renee Castillo. A woman in the third row stood up, dark suit, plain leather folder, no entourage. Richard's face went rigid. You had no business contacting him before the estate review concluded. Renee's expression didn't shift. I represent the independent trustee. We were legally obligated to notify him. Marcus looked back at me, and for half a second his face softened like he was sorry for whatever was about to come out of his mouth. Then Renee explained it plainly. Richard's wife, not Marcus's mother, but the woman he'd married years later, had recently passed, and the resulting estate review had turned up old records connecting Richard to a biological son he'd never publicly acknowledged. A DNA comparison with Richard's own brother had confirmed it. Marcus was entitled to a portion of the family trust, whether Richard wanted him to be or not. He doesn't have to move into that penthouse, Renee said. He doesn't have to work for Callahan Energy. And he doesn't have to sign away his right to talk honestly about his own childhood. The folder in Marcus's hands suddenly looked like exactly what it was, a leash with expensive paper wrapped around it. You knew? I asked him. He nodded. For 3 weeks. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed to know what he actually wanted before I brought you into it. That answer hurt more than it should have. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he'd carried all of it by himself. Richard stepped closer to him. Marcus, we can talk about this privately. You're being pulled in a dozen directions by people with their own agendas. Marcus looked down at the keys in his hand, closed his fingers around them, and said, thank you. I'll keep the keys. Richard's shoulders relaxed and a smile crept back onto his face. Mine, I imagined, disappeared completely. Then Marcus turned to Renee. I'd like my attorney to explain what Mr. Callahan expects in return. Renee walked to the front of the room without hurrying, and I noticed that about her right away, how calm she looked while everyone else in that ballroom had gone stiff. Richard's lawyer was whispering something urgent to one of the assistants. The dean was standing near the podium with both hands clasped like he was calculating whether this had become a legal problem or a public relations one. For the record, Renee said, I represent the independent trustee handling the estate of the late Mrs. Callahan. I do not represent Richard Callahan, Callahan Energy, or this university. Richard's attorney stepped forward. This is a private matter. Renee looked at him evenly. Then perhaps it shouldn't have been announced in front of 200 people. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, nervous but real, and even Marcus looked down to hide a smile. Renee laid out what the trust actually guaranteed. No obligation to move, no obligation to work for the company, no non-disclosure requirement. And as she spoke, I watched people start clapping, a few at first, then more, until most of the ballroom was on its feet. I barely heard any of it. I was watching Richard, watching that polished expression finally crack. "You're destroying the only chance we have to be a family," he said to Marcus. Marcus walked over and set the unsigned agreement down on the podium. "No," he said. "I'm refusing to pretend we already were one." Richard left before the applause died down. His assistant gathered the folder. The other one lingered just long enough to warn Renee that any transfer of the condo would be reviewed carefully. She handed him her card. "I'm sure it will be." He took it without looking at it. Outside, the black SUVs were still parked at the curb, and neither of us said much until we reached my truck in the parking garage. "You okay?" I asked. He gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "I just found out my father's been paying people to watch us for 17 years. I'm still working out how I feel about that." I started the engine, and it made its usual complaint before catching. For the first 10 minutes, we drove without talking. Finally, I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "I told you. I needed to know what he wanted first." "That's not what I asked." He looked at me. "What was I supposed to do? Call you the second Renee reached out and say, 'Hey, Dad, my father's a billionaire and his wife just died, and I might inherit a fortune.' You'd have been in Stillwater before I finished the sentence. Probably. I'm 23, Dad. I'm your father, and I can carry something on my own for 3 weeks." I gripped the wheel tighter. "You carried it alone." "I had Renee." "That's not the same as having me." "No," he admitted, "it isn't." We sat at a red light without speaking. He took off his graduation cap and set it in his lap. "I was trying to protect you," he said. "I don't need protecting from your own life, Marcus. You hide your pain pills from me. That's different." "How is it different?" "It just is." He gave me a tired look. "You still think everything hard belongs on your shoulders, even when nobody asked you to carry it. That's what a father does." "No," he said quietly. "That's what you do." The light turned green. "I saw you take those keys," I said. "For a second, I thought you were leaving with him." His head snapped toward me. "You thought I'd actually go?" I didn't know what to think. After everything? It wasn't about trust. It sounded exactly like it was. I exhaled hard. "It was about me," I admitted. "I'm 62. My knees give out on stairs. I forget things half the time, and you're the one reminding me to take my medicine." Then a man like that walks in with a penthouse and a company and everything I never could have given you, and I thought maybe you'd look at his life and realize you'd settled for mine. He didn't answer right away. We merged onto the highway, and finally he said, "You're not competing with him." It didn't feel that way in there. "He's competing with 17 years he can't get back." I kept my eyes on the road. "And he's losing," Marcus added, "because you were there for every one of them." Something heavy in my chest finally let go. At a rest stop outside Stroud, I pulled in. "What are we doing?" he asked. "My knees need 5 minutes." That wasn't the whole truth. I reached into my jacket and handed him the folded 20 and the card. He frowned. "What's this?" "Your graduation gift." "Dad, just open it." He read the card, 4 words in my handwriting. "For whatever comes next," and his mouth tightened. $20? I know it isn't much. This is the first thing anybody's given me today without wanting something back. He reached across the seat and took my hand, and we sat there until my knees stopped hurting enough to drive again. For about 2 days, I believed the worst of it was over. Then a video of Marcus's speech, recorded by another graduate, went up online, and by the following week, local news picked it up, and by the week after that, it had gone national. Headlines about the foster kid who turned down his oil baron father in front of 200 witnesses. Some people called Marcus ungrateful. Some accused me of poisoning him against his real family, a phrase I read more times than I should have let myself. Richard released a statement claiming he'd attempted a private reconciliation and been ambushed by opportunists. His lawyers challenged the trust claim. They couldn't undo the DNA results, but they could slow everything down with additional testing, questions about old records, demands to review every conversation between Renee and Marcus. Marcus postponed the start date at the engineering firm that had hired him, twice. He gave depositions, signed affidavits, answered the same questions from different lawyers wearing different suits. One evening, I found him at my kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork. "You could walk away from all of it," I told him. He didn't look up. That's exactly what he's hoping I'll do. You don't need the money. It was never about the money. He set his pen down. If I walk away now, he gets to decide that making this difficult was enough to erase me a second time. I understood then that he wasn't fighting for an inheritance. He was fighting for the right to not disappear just because a powerful man found him inconvenient. Around that same time, word came out that Callahan Energy had been quietly paying the investigators who tracked Marcus for years, filed under some line item about risk management, and the board opened a review. Richard didn't lose everything overnight. Real life rarely works that cleanly. But for the first time in his life, something he couldn't fully control had started slipping through his hands. 6 months after graduation, Renee called while Marcus and I were eating chili at my kitchen table. The trustee approved the claim, she said through the speaker. Fully. Marcus closed his eyes and I reached over and took his hand. One more thing, Renee added. Richard has asked for a private meeting before the final paperwork is signed. With lawyers? Marcus asked. No. Cameras, publicity people? No. He says he wants to come alone. 6 months earlier, I'd have laughed at the idea of Richard Callahan going anywhere without an entourage. Marcus picked the place, a small diner off Old Route 66 called the Copper Kettle, where truckers still stopped for coffee before sunrise and the booths had been worn soft by decades of elbows. Richard arrived 5 minutes early, and I barely recognized him. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by jeans and a plain jacket. No security in sight. He looked older, not from wrinkles, but from something heavier sitting on him. He spotted us and walked over slowly. Thank you for coming, he said. Marcus nodded toward the empty side of the booth, and Richard sat down. The waitress poured coffee for all three of us, completely unaware she was interrupting one of the strangest family reunions that diner had ever seen. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Finally, Richard wrapped both hands around his mug. I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times, he said. And? Marcus asked. Every version sounded like I was defending myself. He took a slow breath. I spent 17 years telling myself a story. What story? That I left because I had no other choice. He looked down at the table. There was some truth in that. My father never believed you were mine. He threatened to cut me off entirely, control of everything, if I claimed you. But you didn't come back after he died? No. Why? Richard closed his eyes. Because every year it got harder to imagine how I'd explain the years before it. Silence sat over the table. I got reports on you, he said. At first I only wanted to know you were alive. I know. Then I learned you'd been placed with Walter. He glanced at me but didn't use my name the way you'd use a person's name, more like a fact in a file. I told myself you were safe. And that made it easier to stay away, Marcus said. Yes. He didn't try to soften it. That was the lie I kept repeating until I believed it. Another pause. When I saw the reports about the extra shifts he was working, your school photos, your grades, I convinced myself that showing up would only confuse you. He looked at me directly for the first time. The truth is, I wasn't protecting Marcus. He swallowed hard. I was protecting myself. Those words sat there without anything following them. No excuse trailing behind. Just the truth, finally, plainly stated. The day my wife's estate review started, Richard continued, I wasn't thinking about money. Marcus stayed quiet. I was thinking about secrets. He shook his head slowly. When the trustee started reopening old records, I panicked. A bitter little laugh escaped him. My first thought wasn't that I might get to know my son. My first thought was that the whole state might find out what kind of father I'd been. He looked ashamed saying it. So I tried to control everything. The condo, the agreement, the press, all of it. He met Marcus's eyes. I didn't come back because you needed a father. I came back because I needed control. A tear ran down his face. I'm sorry. That's all I've got. No excuses. No blaming my father, no blaming the lawyers. Marcus watched him for a long moment before he spoke. I believe you're sorry, Richard looked up, something like hope flickering across his face. But believing you're sorry isn't the same as pretending none of it happened. The hope faded into something quieter, more like acceptance. I know, Richard said. Marcus folded his hands on the table. If we're going to have any kind of relationship going forward, there are going to be rules. Richard nodded immediately. Anything. You don't show up at my dad's house without calling first. I won't. You don't send gifts hoping they'll make up for lost time. I understand. You don't ever refer to him as my adoptive father like it's a lesser word. Richard glanced at me, then back at Marcus. I won't. And you never, ever tell anyone that you raised me. His eyes filled again. I won't. If you lie to me about any of this, even once, we're finished. Completely. Richard didn't hesitate. I accept that. The conversation went on for another hour. And by the end of it, nothing had been fixed exactly. But something had shifted. Because for the first time, nobody in that booth was trying to win. Richard asked Marcus about his work. Marcus answered politely. Richard asked about my knees, and I told him they still complained louder than I did, and he actually smiled, a small, human smile, the first real one I'd seen from him. When we stood to leave, Richard reached into his jacket, and I felt my shoulders tighten out of old habit, he noticed. Not a gift, he said softly, and set a folded piece of paper on the table. It was his personal cell number, no assistant, no lawyer. If either of you ever wants to talk, you call me directly. Marcus picked it up. He didn't promise anything. Neither did I. Sometimes that's what forgiveness actually looks like. Not an embrace, not tears, just one door left unlocked in case anyone ever wants to walk through it. A month later, the trustee finalized everything, and Marcus received exactly what the law said belonged to him. He didn't move into the penthouse. He didn't take a job at Callahan Energy. He kept working as an engineer at the same firm that had waited patiently through all of it. The condo was sold, and the proceeds went into a scholarship fund for kids aging out of foster care around the state, laptops, security deposits, transportation grants, the kind of help that would have changed my life at 19 if anyone had thought to offer it. Marcus paid off the remaining balance on my house without asking me first, and I argued about it for 3 straight days. I don't need you paying my bills, I told him. He just smiled. You didn't raise me so I'd owe you. Exactly my point. You raised me so I'd know how to take care of people. This is me taking care of you. I didn't have a good comeback for that. One spring morning nearly a year after graduation, Marcus drove me out to Keystone Lake, and there was a small aluminum fishing boat tied up at the dock. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just about the right size for 2 people and a cooler. He tossed me the keys to the trailer. You kept your promise, I said. No, he said, laughing. You kept yours. We spent the whole afternoon catching almost nothing, and it was about as good an afternoon as I've had in my life. Before we headed home, he asked me to take one picture, not by the boat, not by the water, but standing next to my old truck in the parking lot, the same truck that had carried both of us through every hard year that mattered. He slid his arm around my shoulder. Smile, Dad. I did. That picture sits on my mantle now. People sometimes ask why there isn't a photo from that ballroom, or the condo, or any of it, and the answer is simple enough. Those things were supposed to change his future. That old truck is what reminds us both who actually carried him there. Getting older has taught me something I didn't understand when I was younger, that most fathers aren't afraid of gray hair or bad knees, or a retirement check that doesn't stretch as far as it used to. We're afraid of becoming unnecessary, of waking up one day and realizing the person we spent our whole life loving has simply moved on past us. Marcus taught me something different. If you spend years raising somebody with patience and honesty and love that doesn't come with conditions attached, there may come a day they stop needing you to solve their problems for them. But they will never, not once, forget who home actually was. Blood can explain where a person starts out in this life. It can't explain who stayed. Richard gave Marcus his existence. I was lucky enough to be the one who got to raise him. If somebody in your own life ever proved to you that family isn't about blood, I'd love to hear their story in the comments. Sometimes those stories are the ones that remind the rest of us what actually matters. Claude responded, what Marcus never told his father, but showed him instead, is that love isn't proven by what you're able to give someone, it's proven by what you keep showing. What Marcus never told his father, but showed him instead, is that love isn't proven by what you're able to give someone, it's proven by what you keep showing up with, even when you have almost nothing. A $20 bill given freely can outweigh a penthouse. Presence outweighs money every time. So call the person you love today, not with something to hand them, just with yourself. A small note for you. This story was written and imagined by AI for entertainment, but the lesson inside it about love and presence is real and worth carrying with you.